We're told that for him the highlight of the visit is the beatification of Cardinal John Henry Newman. The truth is that for most people, Newman is a little-known figure. Theologians admire him for the depth of his thinking. English scholars affirm that he's one of the finest prose writers of the 19th century. But is that sufficient to make him a candidate for sainthood? For that is the next logical step. After all, he made enemies easily. A fellow cardinal commented that he was a great hater. So what qualifies the 19th century's best-known convert from Anglicanism to Catholicism to join the ranks of the blessed? Joining me to discuss the significance of John Henry Newman are John Cornwell, Fellow of Jesus College, Cambridge, and author of Newman's Unquiet Grave; Dr. Francis Knight, Associate Professor in the Department of Theology and Religious Studies at Nottingham University; and Dr. Sheridan Gilly, Emeritus Reader in Theology at the University of Durham and author of Newman and His Age. John, what's the fascination of John Henry Newman for you?
I have to say that it is Newman the writer rather than Newman the saint or Newman the churchman. His range of writing was simply prodigious. Poetry, fiction, 32 volumes of wonderful letters. He was a great perfectionist in his writing, and I think that what he was doing was trying to get to that heart-to-heart way, that was his motto, of getting through to people through the imagination and through his writings.
Now, Francis, Monsignor Talbot, who was one of his enemies, it has to be said, called him the most dangerous man in England. What do you think he meant?
Well, it's certainly not a comment I would agree with. He doesn't strike me as dangerous in any way. Newman strikes me as an immensely luminous and creative theological mind. He pursued the subject that we would now call historical theology, bringing his mind into dialogue with the minds of the fathers of the early church and with the biblical writers, and creating new theological thinking on the basis of the tradition within which he was working. That strikes me as something which is immensely valuable and not actually dangerous.
Now, Sheridan, like Newman, you're a convert. You became a Catholic. Is there a fellow feeling?
There's a very strong fellow feeling. But like John, I was originally fascinated by Newman by the sheer power and beauty of his prose. I was, if you like, taken in by his Apologia Pro Vita Sua, his wonderful spiritual autobiography. But then I became fascinated with his intellectual, theological aspect, with the whole idea that one could actually make some kind of coherent sense of Christianity as food for the mind. And it's Newman's mind, I think, which now fascinates me, because he's somebody who saw all the problems in the realm of the intellect which Christianity now faces, and he came to some kind of conclusion about them.
Let's deal with his early childhood. He was born in 1801. What sort of a family was he born into? They were quite wealthy, John.
He was the eldest of 3 sisters and 2 brothers. He didn't get on awfully well with the brothers. He had a wonderfully doting mother, grandmother and aunt who introduced him to Bible reading. But the thing that interests me most of all about his childhood was the huge impact of reading the Arabian Nights tales. I think this was a huge stimulus to his imagination.
The other great impact, though, Sheridan, on his teenage years was an evangelical conversion.
That's really almost the fundamental thing about Newman. There's often said to be a mystery about Newman, or that Newman has a secret. But the secret was a kind of God possession. And you can't understand the rest of his development without recognizing that that kind of God possession was always there with him, inspiring everything he did.
Now, he went up to Trinity College in Oxford, where he got what has to be said was a very poor degree. And then he went and became a fellow of Oriel College, and sometime after that he was ordained into the Church of England. Do you think, Francis, that was an inevitable process?
Oh, yes, very much. I mean, he was an intensely religious man. I don't think he would have ever seriously considered any other calling apart from ordination.
Talk to me about the Oxford movement, because he is looked on as one of the great leaders in the Oxford movement, along with Keble and Pusey. John, what was the Oxford movement? What in its essence was it all about?
It was a perception on the part of a group of devout Oxford dons that the Church of England was in deep trouble. On the one hand, it was being overtaken by the evangelical movement, which had a great emphasis on preaching and Bible reading, but not so much emphasis on the sacraments and indeed the apostolic side of the church, the bishops and so forth. On the other hand, there was this sense that the church was simply going into decay, that it had become a kind of social religion. The church font was used simply as a kind of a place where you dumped your outer clothing and so forth. What they were doing was exploring a renewal of the church by going back to the writings of the early church, the great early fathers of the church.
And they wrote tracts, Sheridan.
Yes, well, the Tracts for the Times, which begin in 1833, were an attempt to recall the Church of England to its Catholic inheritance. But this recovery of Catholic tradition then posed a tremendous problem. What did you do with the Protestant tradition in the Church of England? And I think that's where Newman's attempt to redefine the Anglican middle way, or via media, between Protestantism and Catholicism has left the Church of England with a tremendous problem. Is the Church of England Protestant or Catholic? Or indeed, with the rise of the so-called Broad Church or liberal movement, is it liberal? And the conflicts in the modern Church of England actually derive in part from an attempt to decide in what sense and in what degree the Church of England is an amalgam of those three different traditions.
And Francis, he came to the conclusion eventually. He wrote perhaps the most famous tract of all, Tract 90, in which he tried to argue that the 39 Articles of the Church of England were in continuity with the teaching of the Church of Rome. But shortly after that, he decided that that was an untenable position, and he decided that the Church of England was not part of that apostolic succession. How catastrophic was that, do you think, in terms of the impact on the times in which he was living?
It had a huge impact because he was the leader, the very influential leader of this movement within the Church of England. There was great concern that other people would be leaving the Church of England for the Church of Rome. Converting to Rome was a very, very major decision, very, very different from the kind of decision that somebody would be making today. His departure was seen as a very major blow, particularly as it was felt that he might in fact have been a secret Roman Catholic before his conversion, and that brought his integrity into doubt.
John.
The supposition, particularly on the part of people like Charles Kingsley, who would attack him for this, that
the somehow water babies.
Indeed, yes, that he had been secretly a Catholic all along, was utterly false. I think that he was obviously agonised and was going backwards and forwards, and he used to call that sort of discussion within himself as saying and unsaying as he moved forward.
He took the decision finally in 1845 and he converted. And Sheridan, he formed an oratory. Why an oratory?
Newman looked at a number of Roman Catholic religious orders, Jesuits, Vincentians, Rosminians, but he wanted something which could carry a certain amount of intellectual ballast and had the kind of freedom of inquiry which was there in an Oxford college. And of course, the oratory isn't strictly speaking a religious order. It's an institute of secular priests who are allowed to retain their own property. In the late 1850s, he became very depressed, and he stopped writing because he was suspected of not being sufficiently sympathetic with the Pope's attempt to retain the Papal States. But then, of course, he writes the Apologia, and this has an enormous impact upon his reputation. It recovers for him the goodwill of Protestant England. I think at that point he becomes a great Englishman again, an Englishman of whom the English can be proud.
Francis.
The Apologia is, a disarmingly honest document, which he found extremely painful to write, but clearly people read it and they thought, well, this is actually a very plausible and coherent account of this man's life and the changing religious opinions which he's held. So I think he was very much rehabilitated.
John.
I think we have to ask, what is there in the Apologia for us today? And he didn't want to write a book that was relying apparently on just his memory. He was retrieving from all over the place, getting back letters from friends and looking back through his vast archive to bring it together so that every section of the book appears to be taken from contemporaneous thoughts and writings. It comes across, I think, as one of the really great spiritual autobiographies of all time. I think what it shows is the agony of one individual who is trying to find the true church and showing you every step of that tortuous way.
Towards the end of his life, the Church acknowledged the contribution that he had made by offering him a cardinal's hat. It was an unusual step, Sharon, because he had never gone the usual course of becoming a bishop first.
Yes, Leo XIII was trying to rebuild bridges between the English states and the Holy See, and between European culture and civilization and the Holy See. And I think what he saw in Newman was a symbol of such reconciliation.
Well, let me remind you that you're listening to Beyond Belief, and today we're discussing the life and impact of John Henry Newman. The Pope will beatify him next week, the final step before he can be made a saint. What's he done to deserve such an honour? Has he left a lasting legacy? Has he any message for Christians today? And with me are John Cornwell and Sheridan Gilly, both Catholics, and both of whom have written biographies of Newman, and Francis Knight, an Anglican whose major area of academic interest is Christianity in the West in the 19th century. Newman made the journey from Anglicanism to Rome at much personal cost. Brett Lockhart, who's an eminent QC in Northern Ireland, took a similar path 150 years later, and the dominant influence on his journey was John Henry Newman. I put it to Brett Lockhart that given the context of the times in which he lives, that must have been a difficult decision.
The desire in Northern Ireland is always not to rock the boat or to move from one's own community. And therefore I think part of the reason I was so inspired by Newman, for instance, was that it was a huge decision for him as well. I'd never met anyone before who had made the same journey, and therefore the time, for instance, that Newman took actually helped me enormously, because I think it was 12 years from when I started thinking about it until I actually was received into the church.
Now, you mentioned Newman taking his time. Newman was also very committed before he became a Catholic. He was a very committed Anglican and very committed high Anglican part of the Oxford movement. And you were quite committed too before you became a Catholic.
Through the charismatic renewal in my early 20s, I got very involved in church and in Christianity generally. And at that stage, as years went by, then I started to ask certain questions because of the contacts that I'd had.
I'm still grateful for the basis that your background gave you.
I'm very concerned, even when I talk about it, to ensure that I don't in any way denigrate it. I'm very proud of my own Presbyterian background. There are many wonderful Christians that I met in the Presbyterian Church that I still have contact with today who inspire me in faith, and I really am most anxious not to disparage, their faith. And again, I found inspiration in Newman because he was concerned to always act in charity.
Now, tell me about Newman. You started to read him. What was the appeal in the writings of Newman?
I was just fascinated by this person who had been such a leader in the Oxford movement and who'd asked himself the same kind of questions that I was asking myself, which is, I didn't believe the church started in 1517, and I wanted to know why there was such a multiplicity of churches. And in Northern Ireland terms, we tend not to ask ourselves, from the Protestant background, the difficult questions. We're so convinced from an early age that we are correct and that the Catholics are wrong about various things, that sometimes we actually neglect some of the very big questions that we face ourselves. I think initially I was reticent. I think Irish Catholicism was often linked in a way with nationalism that I found rather alienating. And again, it was because Newman was very deeply rooted in a kind of scriptural, patristic, biblical tradition that I was very comfortable with.
Now, Newman's conversion caused him a great deal of personal pain because it meant that some of the relationships which were very precious to him were damaged and some were even severed. I'm wondering, did that happen to you when you announced your conversion?
The truth is, I was fearful of it. Before I made the decision, I had to come to terms with the fact that this may be one of the consequences. There were some very close friends who had difficulties. We worked hard at it, and I think we've come to a place of peace. So, yes, of course there were people who would look askance at it, but my own family and friends and professional colleagues have actually been very generous.
So if you had to put in a sentence why you think it's important that he be beatified, what would you say?
I think he was a very saintly man. I think he stands wonderfully in the tradition of English saints, and one has to recognise the enormous sacrifice it was for him to take the decision that he did, to obey the light of his own conscience and to come to the conclusion, as difficult as that was in mid-19th century England, to become a Catholic.
That was Brett Lockhart. And Francis, I am struck by the similarity between his journey and that of John Henry Newman.
Yes, and I'm very interested in listening to that Mr. Lockhart emphasised two things. First of all, the time which it took him to come to his change of faith, and also the way in which he was influenced by Newman's understanding of the scriptural and the patristic tradition.
What does it mean to be beatified? Can we just draw that distinction? Because there's a difference. Beatification is a step towards canonisation, but there is a difference. What is the distinction?
Well, one important difference is that beatification means that the Church is sanctioning a local cult, whereas canonisation is a universal cult of the Church. In Newman's case, it's rather interesting, isn't it? Because I don't think there's a great local cult in Birmingham necessarily. I mean, when they did the removal of his relics, or attempted to remove his relics, not very many local people turned out. There were prelates from all over the place, including Sheridan and myself. Not prelates, but interested characters. And so I think what's perhaps local about Newman is the fact that he is a kind of literary saint, if there's such a thing, and very specific to the English-speaking Catholic world.
And Sheridan, as John says, you were present at that moment, and unfortunately they found nothing in the grave because the body had decomposed.
Yes, he wasn't there. He had risen. I was, in a sense, rather touched by that there was so little to find.
I want to concentrate on the personality of John Henry Newman. And John, your book, Newman's Unquiet Grave, you've given it a subtitle, you've called it The Reluctant Saint. What would he have made of the idea that he might become a saint?
I think he would have been absolutely horrified. And, I mean, the reason that nothing was found in his grave was that on his orders, the coffin was compacted with a rich garden compost to hasten the decomposition. And I think that he saw those relic hunters coming from that distance, 120 years ago, and was determined to foil them. And it's interesting that he always said, I'm not a saint because I'm a literary man. And of course that indicates his own consciousness of the self-absorption and the egocentricity of the writer. And of course there was quite a lot of that in Newman's nature.
Well, he was a literary man, but he was a literary man whose pen could drip with venom. He was very waspish at times. He made enemies quite readily. I've quoted Cardinal Manning, who said he was a great hater. That doesn't sound to me like a saint, Sheridan.
I suppose that Newman's defects, as far as he has them, are the defects of the intellectual classes. He was so clever, he could always make fun of someone whom he disliked. And I'm afraid that as a mere academic myself, I really need someone like that in heaven to pray for me, because he knows exactly what my temptations are. We intellectuals don't have many saints, and we need a few of them.
Francis.
Of course, because he wrote so much, in a way we know far too much about him. I mean, very, very few other saintly figures would have had anywhere near as much information about them still on record, which of course we can reconstruct and pore over.
Well, you see, I'm intrigued, John, because reading your book, what comes across to me is that he was very good at receiving love. I'm not so sure he was good at giving it, which brings us to the subject of his very close friend, Father Ambrose. And his demands on Ambrose almost killed him.
This relationship with Ambrose St. John is, I think, very interesting because, as you say, it's quite true that all his remarks indicate that he was conscious of Ambrose's love for him. It was very rarely, I think perhaps only once, stated the other way around. And I think that Newman needed a great deal of help to get through life. Ambrose was a man who would pack his bags for him. He was a shoulder to cry on. He did all kinds of sort of practical things and intellectual things too. He translated works from German and French and so forth, and Newman didn't have those languages. And so it was almost like a wife but without the marriage bed. He was absolutely depended on him. And it wasn't until he died, Ambrose died 15 years earlier than Newman, that he realised just how dependent he was on him, and he was just devastated by it.
The issue has been raised. Was Newman gay? I don't think anybody's claiming he had a gay relationship with Father Ambrose, but the issue nevertheless has arisen because he was clearly a man who felt most at home in close male friendship relationships.
I think if you define homosexuality in modern terms as somebody who was sexually attracted to another person, Newman was not a homosexual. He didn't feel such attraction, but he doesn't seem to have felt such attraction towards women either. And I wonder whether it's that primary religious conversion, which means that the first place always has to be given to God, and all other relationships, however loving, are somehow secondary to it. As far as we know, he has no great interest in sex after that conversion.
I wonder about that, because surely there must be many people who have gone through a similar conversion and yet had a significant other sexual partner in their lives. If you read through those 32 volumes of letters, it's difficult to find anywhere a sense of, and this is putting it into post-Freudian terms, a sense of strong libido towards either men or women. Interestingly, a lot of people felt attracted to him in a kind of sexual way, this sort of extraordinary charisma, which seemed to have, for others, not for Newman himself, a tinge of homoeroticism about it.
Benedict XVI is clearly very fascinated by John Henry Newman. John, what do you think the attraction of Newman to the Pope is?
I'm somewhat perplexed about Benedict's regard for Newman, because he seems to be reinterpreting Newman. He met the bishops of England and Wales in February, in which he held up Newman as the great exemplar of a theologian who never dissented from papal teaching, from what we call papal magisterium. And that seems to me to be turning Newman completely upside down. So I'm actually rather perplexed about Benedict's regard for Newman.
Sheridan.
Well, of course, this is the trouble with Newman, that he is a many-sided figure, and you can emphasise one aspect of him rather than another, and get the answer you want.
One connection that I can find is his attack on relativism. Benedict is clearly opposed to relativism, the idea that all religions express ultimate truth. Newman was also opposed to relativism. That seems to be one link between the two.
But aren't we all? I don't think it's saying a great deal. To say then that Newman wasn't progressive, that he didn't have an open mind, that he didn't think that things should be questioned, I think is false.
Again, one of the reasons that Benedict may like Newman is the fact that he was a convert. And Benedict has recently held out the hand of welcome to Anglicans who may be anxious to move over to Rome. Do you think that's part of the attraction?
It may well be, yes. What I would want to stress, really, is that Newman is the Church of England's greatest gift to Roman Catholicism. It was very much the Anglican world from which he came, which allowed him to be the sort of thinker that he was. And I think that's something which isn't, at the present moment, being sufficiently appreciated. I mean, the papal website, which I've been tiptoeing around, says that the Church of England could not embrace the truth that Newman taught, which strikes me as actually rather disingenuous, because Newman is still seen as preeminent among theologians, and Anglicans would still take his teachings very seriously. And in fact, as a result of his influence, Anglicans became more theologically sophisticated, more sacramental and more Catholic.
So do you resent the fact that Benedict is sort of appropriating Newman entirely for the Catholic Church?
If that's what he's doing, yes, I would. I very much hope that when he comes, he will say that Newman belongs to everybody, because Newman is beyond denomination, it seems to me. He should belong to all thinking Christians.
I want to turn to the miracle that has been quoted as proof of Newman's capacity for beatification. One miracle is required for beatification, another will be required before he is canonised. And John, in your book you are very critical of the particular miracle that is quoted on Newman's behalf.
It seems to me to be a rather thin miracle, as miracles go. I mean, a miracle must be an event which, according to a certain panel, a medical panel in the Vatican, is said to be beyond scientific explanation. I managed to acquire the entire evidence for this miracle. Essentially, this was a man who had had a very bad back. He had an operation for this bad back, and it was the speed with which he returned to pain-free function which was said to be the miracle. So I showed this to two of the leading experts in this particular condition in the whole of Europe, and they said it was nonsense, that they had had similar cases without appeals to miracles where this had happened. And so I am in some doubt about the strict, beyond scientific explanation side of this.
Anglicans will tend to find the process of beatification a bit mystifying, and the most mystifying bit, I think, is the insistence on a physical healing miracle, because it does seem to produce a very mechanistic view of God. It's also the kind of thing that Newman himself disapproved of, really.
I'd like to ask each one of you a final question, and that is, what is Newman's lasting message for our society today, John?
For me, he is a very great spiritual figure who means a lot to Catholics, to all Christians who are not Catholics, and indeed to people who are not Christians at all and people who have no faith at all. Because his central message is that we should follow our conscience, however hard that is, and that we should not take in a docile fashion everything that authority of parents, school and church, or maybe synagogue or other religion, tells us.
Sheridan.
For me, I think his great role is as an analyst of the bases of modern religious doubt, and as the champion of the possibility of making some kind of rational and logical sense of Christianity. Newman is the great doctor of the modern period for those like me who have moved rather reluctantly from doubt.
Francis.
He's somebody that we can still talk to, whose writings still make a great deal of sense. I think for English people, he's one of our very few outstanding thinkers. And even if you're not interested in religion, his use of English prose is outstanding. Just read him and listen to what he has to say.
Well, there we must leave it. John Henry Newman will be beatified by Pope Benedict in Cofton Park in Birmingham next Sunday. My thanks to Francis Knight, Sheridan Gilley and Joan Cornwall for helping throw light on his legacy. I'll be back at the same time next week, and I hope you'll join me.